about Cannes, I thought. I have this moment of like,
It was.
this whole
Sorry to put you off.
This whole thing is this bullshit.
I just made it. How do you think I got to? You're more important for it.
And I was kind of like, oh fuck. I had a good girl moment. I was like, oh, but I did my work.
I did it. I did it. I
did my work.
I got it off your book. No, I've always just kind of felt like it's like you know, this is a contrast between screen.
We're just going to give it one more minute for all of those people who are just piling in on Zoom. I see you. Thank you for coming. We have a lot of people on the Zoom link tonight. Yeah. We've got almost 100 people on Zoom. Yeah, right. Well, they're on their way in. They're all coming in now. So yeah, it's excellent. Yeah, it's great. So even though people couldn't join us in real life as much, we've got a lot of Zoomers, which is fantastic. Yeah, it's really, really good. But we're just going to give it one more minute as we get the last people through, and then we're going to start. Very strange. Front row. Beautiful. We might get started. There may be some people coming through during the night, but we'll get started for now. And just for everybody here in the audience, we put on fireworks for Anthony tonight. Congratulations, the fireworks are happening behind us, and it's all because of this book, Beyond the Hero's Journey. And also the helicopters sort of going around filming it. So you're all being zoomed by a helicopter, I think, tonight, which is good. Look, just before we start, I'd like to just make sure that everyone in the room has their phone to silent so it doesn't go off in the middle of the event. At home on Zoom, you can do whatever you want. You can play loud music during this event. You can cook. You can shout at people. And you can also be in the nude, but with your camera off, if that's okay. And so for the people in the room here tonight, there's a toilet over there that if you need to use, you can use the toilet. It's a little bit dark on the way over there because there's a light bulb blown, but there's also a toilet upstairs. So there's a sign saying don't use it, but that's only for other customers. Please feel free to use. If you're here as a guest for an event, you can use the toilet. So yes, very strange rules here, just similar to everything in COVID. The rules are not consistent, as expected. So to start off this evening, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on in this area, the Yagara and the Turrbal people, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And also, I'd like to acknowledge that we are zooming out onto the lands of many different Aboriginal people across this nation, and I'd like to pay respects to their elders as well, wherever you're zooming from. This always will be Aboriginal land. Sovereignty was never ceded, and this has always been storytelling land. And so it's really appropriate that we're actually continuing that tradition tonight by talking about a book about storytelling to two groups of people. We've had to swap tonight's event, which was a rather un-COVID safe number of people. We've had to make it into two groups of COVID safe numbers of people. So fantastic to see people could do that at a minute's notice, which was really fantastic. So tonight it is my great pleasure to welcome this book into the world. I just have to say up front that this particular book, Anthony Mullins is my partner, full disclosure, and because Anthony Mullins is my partner, he has read all of the drafts of my books that I've written over the years, and they would be complete crap without his knowledge of structure and ability to see exactly where I've gone terribly wrong in each of those drafts and to guide me towards a much better path with them. So this book, I highly, highly recommend it to anybody who is a writer, particularly, I mean, sure, screenwriting as well, but if you're a writer of fiction and don't feel like a screenwriting book works for you, think again, because this book has saved my life as a novelist on many, many occasions. So I'd like to get that over and done with. Thank you very much, Anthony, for making me a very successful writer. Thank you. He did tell me not to do the octopus sex stuff, but that's okay. It's another story.
It worked out fine.
It worked out fine at the end.
She was right.
So tonight I'd like to welcome the wonderful Jo Dillon, who is here, who is doing the second conversation with Anthony for the night, a trooper. So in addition to being Screen Queensland's Chief Creative Officer, Jo is co-chair of the Screen Diversity and Inclusion Network, alongside Benjamin Law, who's done a great endorsement for this book as well, overseeing investment in Australian and co-produced fiction and factual screen stories for all platforms, and the development of projects and creative talent. She has developed screen stories in Australia and the UK for more than 10 years, and most recently as the development executive for Screen Australia. And she is an amazing person, and we're very, very lucky to have her in Queensland. Welcome, Jo Dillon.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. And can I also acknowledge the owners of the land on which we're gathered this evening and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are in the audience. Welcome to all of you, and in particular, thank you to Chrissy, to Avid Reader, and of course to Anthony, who I think you likes you.
I think
we got at least a shot. Anyway, Anthony is an award-winning screenwriter whose talent was identified very early in his career, when his first short film was selected for official competition at the prestigious Cannes Film Festival. He went on to win an more than one. He went on to win Augie and BAFTA awards for his writing, which has seen him credited on some of the biggest shows in the world, including the hit US series Lost. In Australia, he's written, script produced, script edited award-winning shows, including International Emmy Award winner Safe Harbour, which he shepherded from the screen from concept during a stint with Universal-owned Matchbox Pictures. Anthony has a doctorate in visual arts from Queensland College of Art in Brisbane, and this book, Beyond the Hero's Journey, which we're here to launch tonight, is at least in part based on thinking that has evolved over his working life, but also his education through a master's and a doctorate.
I use it very often. I use it on planes. It doesn't do any
Do
good.
you get better food?
No, I'm a bit afraid I'll actually ask the folks.
Yeah, you don't want to get into that. Anyway, I was so pleased that Anthony had asked me to be a part of the launch for Beyond the Hero's Journey, not least because it meant that I was able to have an early opportunity to read this book, which is a really wonderful exploration of screenwriting and storytelling, told from a number of different kinds of perspectives, and it's really accessible, it's beautifully crafted, and it had my mind racing in lots of different directions as I read it, and so I would highly recommend it to you. And I would also suggest that Anthony might sign a copy for you if he hasn't already.
I will.
The book is quite unapologetic in the way that it busts some of the myths that dominate thinking on screenwriting and stories. Among them, the 3-act structure and the hero's journey, which those of you who are screenwriters will know is, well, it's almost sacrilegious.
It's all we've got, really. It feels like for the last 40 years, it's just been the 3-act structure, the hero's journey. Who's familiar with the hero's journey? Put up your hand. 3-act structure. No, it's kind of about half. Yeah.
So sort of some pretty big myth busting going on here. Look, The book has been really brilliantly received, as you might expect. Benjamin Law, creator writer of the family law, called it modern, relevant and fresh. He counsels writers, don't start writing scripts without it, so don't. Michael Lucas, the creator and writer of Five Bedrooms, Party Tricks and the Newsreader, said that the new analytical tools that the book supplies just might inspire you to write something genuinely original, which I have to say I'm very excited about. And Meg O'Connell, who's the co-creator and writer of Retrograde, said it was a joy to read it and a necessary evolution in critical analysis. So, congratulations, Anthony. I can't wait to explore a little bit more about the book with you this evening, and I'm sure the audience feels exactly the same way about that. I'm going to ask a couple of questions of you too. Just to get by show of hands, who is a screenwriter? And who is a writer of another type? And who is just interested in the general idea of stories and writing? And who is a member of the Anthony Mullins fan club?
Oh, that's good, yeah. That's really interesting. Very revealing.
You people didn't. A few people didn't put their hands
No,
up.
I don't know where I stand.
You know.
But they will by the end of this.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Positive
will.
thinking there.
So, Anthony, can you tell us a little bit about how the book came about? There's a lot of thinking in there. There's a lot of ideas, and I know that you've spoken about how the diagrams that run through the book that plot out, I suppose, the shapes of stories that you analyse and some of the first things that you did. But I'd be interested to know how it all sort of came together.
It's been it's been an evolution over some period of time. You're right. The place where it's sort of the seed of the idea of the book started with diagrams. Like, so if you look at the book, there's some of these diagrams throughout it, and it's sort of I started drawing those a long time ago. I was doing a master's with Jared Lee, who is the writer of Top of the Lake, and Jared's approach to teaching didn't involve many lectures. It was mostly about sitting around, watching movies, and then having really rowdy arguments about them, which is really entertaining. It's a
And you get
fantastic.
a degree for that, so.
Exactly, I got a master's out of it. It's great. It was a really fun time. Shane Armstrong is here. You know, he was there at the same time, and a lot of our conversations obviously will revolve around character as well as plot, but also in particular structure. You know, what's the structure of this film? How does it work? How does it fit together? You know, why does it work? Why does it not work? Those sorts of things. And at that time, and even today really, the only sort of analytical tools we had to work with in terms of understanding structure in screenwriting and storytelling was the 3-act structure and the hero's journey. So they're basically two concepts which have dominated screenwriting theory for it's much, you know, more than 40 years, 50 years, 60 years potentially. And they tell a very particular type of story. It's a story where it has 3 parts. There's a beginning, middle, and an end. And in that story, in the hero's journey, the character sets out into unfamiliar lands, and they experience conflicts and struggles, and they have an emotional transformation, have an emotional resurrection, I guess, where they're a different person by the end of the story than they were at the beginning of the story. And in that story, everything's really great at the end. It all works out well. This transformation they go through is liberating. It makes life great for them. But you know, as we were watching these films, I'm trying to remember some of the films, and it's all a bit of a blur that we're watching it, because they're all very strange films. I think American Splendor was one of them. But anyway, like a lot of these films, they just didn't fit that structure. That oftentimes end very bleakly, or things would be a bit sort of in between. It wouldn't necessarily be optimistic, or sometimes the character wouldn't change at all, or sometimes there didn't appear to be a story at all. And what I was aware of at that time was we didn't really have a way of talking about those films that didn't fit those structures. But when it came to writing and working with, and as I went on to work in professional environments, I knew that we as writers, we were certainly writing things that didn't fit the 3-act structure or the hero's journey, but we didn't really have a vocabulary to talk about what we were doing. We had an intuition, working in writers' rooms and those sorts of things. You'd throw ideas around and everyone had intuitions about what worked and what didn't. But we didn't really have a way of describing what it was that we were doing. And so as it started with these diagrams in my master's project, what I wanted to try and find out was, what are we doing as writers as we try to put a story together? What are the techniques and the ideas that help us structure our stories? And I followed through those ideas in a PhD. It wasn't on that subject specifically, but it was certainly in the subtext of it. And it sort of came to a head in a workshop that I ran here about 2 years ago. It was called Screenwriting for Novelists. And I kind of felt like I had the courage to sort of present some of the ideas that I've been exploring for way too long at that point. And I took a group of novelists through the ideas that I was exploring to see how it would work. And they really responded really well. And at the end of it, they said, look, you should really write that up into a book, because I've never heard it described that way. As a novelist, it works for me. I can see a way through what I'm doing, and it opens up the storytelling landscape for me, so that I know now that I don't have to do this, really prescriptive 3-act structure or hero's journey sort of approach. So yeah, so it was a workshop that happened here on the veranda where you're sitting now.
All began here, folks. So really what you're telling me is doodling in class was the genesis of this book.
Pretty much, yeah. I wasn't concentrating on Jared was saying.
But did you have a theory or premise in your mind at a certain point that you set out to prove? You watched a lot of films and analysed a lot of films in the course of writing the book, and probably many more that aren't part of the book itself.
Sure.
But was that an exercise in trying to prove an idea, or did you watch the films and find the idea inside of that?
I guess I did do a lot of watching films and trying to think, how would you describe the structure of this, and try and find an approach that embraced the way writers work, I think, which is to discover what the story is as you're going along, rather than knowing everything about your story at the beginning. Because what formulas like the 3-act structure and the hero's journey do, and this is my experience of it, and this is the experience of many writers, is because they're so prescriptive, they lay out in very, very tight structures, 12 stages that your story must go through, or 3 turning points, or a couple of midpoints, or whatever it is. It's almost like at the beginning of the storytelling process, the structure knows more about your story than you do, and you haven't even written it yet. And it kind of felt off, that it kind of felt wrong that a structure would know more about your story than you do. It's your story. And my experience of my beautiful wife Chrissy is a novelist, so I know a lot of novelists, and I know for a fact that a lot of novelists do not start with a plan. They do not start with a highly structured plan of what they're going to do. They discover the story as they go. And I wanted to find an approach that would embrace that, I guess, so that you could embark on your story and discover it along the way, rather than be told by a formula what your story is. And my hunch was that you were much more likely to find the story that you wanted to tell that way.
Because there's risk in that formula, isn't there?
Oh yeah,
In particular for those.
get lost along the way.
Yes, and in particular for those writers who perhaps don't have that confidence of experience and who haven't yet found their own voice as a writer. There's sometimes a tendency to go, this is the way I'm supposed to do it, and to deliver to that, rather than to deliver to something that's much more truthful?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if the three-act structure of the hero's journey helps you write something, great, use it. But it may end up that you want to write another type of story that doesn't fit those structures, and to not be afraid to go there, or to at least, part of the purpose of this book is to offer you a way of finding your way through that forest, I guess, if you want to tell a story that's outside of that.
And did you set out thinking, right, there's these myths and I'm going to bust them? And if you did, was there anything that felt for you off limits? Anything that was too sacred, I suppose, to put on the table and examine?
Well, I did sort of procrastinate for, a good 15 years before I wrote the book. So I wasn't sort of, when the workshop kind of said, you should really write that up because it's really useful and interesting and valuable. My first response to them was, the world does not need another screenwriting book, because there are literally thousands and thousands of them out there. And they all essentially say exactly the same thing, which is it's either a three-act structure or the hero's journey. And I guess, part of me, they were kind of saying, yeah, well, that's why you should write it, because, yours is different to that. But I guess their argument was pretty strong. So I eventually relented and did start writing it. But when I got to that point, I had a lot of material because I'd been thinking about it for a long time. And it was just, I don't know, it's just one of those itches I had to scratch. And when I came to writing the book, it sort of came fairly easily. I guess I deliberated on it long enough that I felt like I had a way through, and I had a particular approach that I could describe to people.
So, without sort of giving away too many spoilers, what's the big idea?
Well, I'm going to say it out loud here.
You do have to buy it also.
I'm going to say it out loud here. And when I say it out loud, like anyone who's a writer is going to go, yeah, right. But it's important to think of it in terms of what this approach offers you. And basically, I mean, the big idea is it's character arcs, kids. It's very, very simple. It's something that we do intuitively with all of our stories. We look at the journey of that character through the story. Who are they at the beginning of the story? What happens to them in the middle? Where are they by the end? How do things work out for them? Are they the same person at the end of the story? And it's interesting, like the idea of character arcs has kind of gone mainstream in the last 10 years, thanks to television. Oftentimes when people are talking about television shows and how those shows are sort of rolling out, they're often talking about the characters' arcs. It's like, I just don't believe what that character's doing anymore. Or I can't believe how they finished their story, or I just love how that story ended. It made so much sense for that character. And what they're essentially talking about there is a character arc. And it's what I've found that pretty much all writers, even if they're using slightly different terminologies, all professional writers are generally talking about a character arc when they're figuring out the story. So the approach that I've taken in the book is to, the starting point is to say the hero's journey is a character arc, but it's a very particular type of character arc. It's one where the character emotionally changes and things work out because of that change. But of course, there are many stories where, things don't work out, or things are a little bit in between, where things are a little bit ambivalent. Maybe it's a bit of good and a bit of bad. For example, a film that has done incredibly well this year is Nomadland. So the arc of that character, you can feel that character change. They're not the same person at the end of the story that they were at the beginning, but things aren't optimistic. Things are kind of ambivalent. It's like, will things work out? Maybe it'll be a bit of good, a bit of bad. There's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of nuance at the end of that story. So it's a changed character with an ambivalent arc. Another example recently is, Promising Young Woman, for example. That character doesn't really change. They're the same person they are at the end of the story as they were at the beginning. They're tempted to change in the middle of the story. I'm not giving too much away there. But at the end of the story,
seen it, right?
Everyone's seen it. I'm sure everyone's seen it.
They're nodding. The ones I can see.
and I rewatched it again recently, and it's a terrific example of a constant character where that character is tempted to change, but eventually they hold firm to everything that they believed at the beginning of the story, and they have sweet revenge. And it's, I would say, an ambivalent arc for them. You know, it's kind of a bit of good and a bit of bad. Again, I'm not giving too much away there. But it's an example of approaching a story through a character arc opens up the landscape for you so that you have options, I guess. Things don't always have to work out perfectly, and that your character doesn't always have to change. And I can't figure out why it took me 15 years to work that out. But I think part of it is because it's intuitive. We all kind of do it. That's what we're looking for in a story. We're looking for the shape of that story. And the way that I describe it in the book is a character arc is the emotional shape of the story. What's happening inside the character and how do the events affect them?
So you watched and analysed a huge number of films in the sort of pursuit of these discoveries. You obviously love them,
Yes.
but they're incredibly different and very wide-ranging. I just wondered how you'd actually gone about selecting those films. How did you choose the stories that you wanted to talk about?
Well, the thing you said before is I had to love them because I was going to be spending a lot of time with them. I also I wanted to make sure that it was a range of films that, you know, in each chapter I included one classic, film that everyone had seen, but then two very recent films, because a lot of screenwriting books are a lot of the time they're referring to films that are like 30, 40, 50 years old. They're amazing films, no doubt about it. But it's nice to update so that, so that we're talking about films that we've all seen recently and that we're engaging with and that talk about today, I guess. And I wanted to make sure that there were films that audiences had embraced, but also critics as well. So, they're really well-known films, but they're all really different in their own ways, different genres, different tones, also different points of view. So different people from different backgrounds, films from around the world. So that I guess part of that was about testing my theory, I guess. Does my idea about character arcs really work across very different genres and very different tones and very different points of view? And I mean, so far so good. I mean, until you've done a comprehensive study of every film that's ever existed, we'll never know. But the sample is okay so far. It's working out.
Yeah, and no one's going to do that, so we're fine.
Yes.
But were there films that you struggled with? You mentioned in the book a couple of times, you kind of run a little bit of commentary about some of the films, in particular in regards to point of view or to the identity of the writer and their relationship with the story in relation to diversity, usually.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if there were films that you struggle with and any that you just kind of felt, no, I can't go there and include that.
Just trying to think. So with a particular film in there, Lost in Translation, for example, all of the films are in the book. It was really important to me that there were really good examples of what I was talking about in terms of an arc. And so Lost in Translation is in the book. And I talk about it in relation to what I call a minimalist arc. So that's an arc where it's like the normal storytelling settings have all been turned down, the volume's been turned down. And if you remember Lost in Translation, it's a very quiet interior film where there aren't big dramatic turning points and there's not great big dramatic character choices. Everything's kind of turned down, it's very quiet. And I think that's what everyone loved about that film when it came out. So when I sat down to watch it again, thinking this is going to be a great example of a minimalist arc, I was really struck by how incredibly dated the film has become in 20 years. The Japanese stereotypes in it are really uncomfortable to watch. And there are quite a few of them. I mean, I talk about in the book that I think what Sofia Coppola was reaching for at that time was a sort of misanthropic sort of point of view, in that, you know, those two characters, they hated everyone. Like the lounge singer got a terrible time in the film, and you know, everyone got a bad time. But in particular, the representation of the Japanese characters, they were either buffoons or they were sort of held in this sort of weird, you know, holy reverence. And so the film had sort of dated, and I was on the edge of just dropping the film from the book and not sort of talking about it, finding another example. And I remember thinking, I want to talk about this. I want to put it in there and kind of say, I want to talk about the things I like about this film, that I engaged with it, and talk about how it's a great example of a minimalist art, but at the same time acknowledge its weaknesses. And part of the reason why I wanted to do that was because that's the bit about filmmaking that I love, or watching films. It's when you come out of a film and you sit down with your friends and you talk about it, and it engages you, and you have a debate about it, and it's like, I really love, you know, these aspects of it, but this part troubles me. And I kind of, I didn't want to step away from that part of the film appreciation process that I love so much. Is when you have arguments about films, it's kind of great. And so I kind of, there were a few films in there, like the Hurt Locker is an incredible film, but the point of view in that film is so locked into the point of view of its soldier that the other characters, the people that live in the world of that film, are quite alien, and that produces a particular point of view that is troubling in the film, in that. And so I wanted to leave those aspects in there, because I think it's a part of what films do for us, is they push us, they challenge us, and sometimes they get it wrong. At the same time, they're getting a lot of things so right. So, you know, I wanted to keep those imperfections in there, I guess.
Yeah, I think when you're exploring something like this, when you're looking at a body of work as large as this, I think you do have to have the grit and the oyster there a little bit. You have to look at those things that didn't work as well as those things that did. You know, and I think that's, for me, something that gives the book its authenticity, because you're not just kind of presenting, and I guess that's the whole point. You're not presenting this one perfect way of telling stories and rendering everything else useless and unfinanceable.
Yeah, it's the book is very much about kind of finding other ways of understanding story, but also just seeing the world, I guess, and understanding the world. And kind of wanted the selection of films to reflect that as well.
So these small films that you're talking about, I mean, the book does obviously look at some blockbusters alongside them, but I was just kind of thinking whether in the examination of the films that you looked at, whether you could see any trends really. Does the hero's journey sell? Do these smaller films that don't have that hero's journey, that don't have the 3-act structure, that don't have the change arc, do they struggle to make box office?
Well, it's funny because I would say no. Oftentimes what's argued, you know, where there's a lot of filmmakers here, and you'll all attest to this, is sometimes things like the 3-act structure and the hero's journey are used to bully you into making a more commercial film, or what's allegedly a more commercial film. And the 3-act structure and the hero's journey do not guarantee a commercial film. One of my first experiences of when I first made a short film, I went to the Cannes Film Festival, and I went to the market while I was there, the Cannes market, and literally every year there are tens of thousands of films being sold there, and it kind of put in perspective how much content is out there. And this is like 20 years ago I'm talking about. I can't imagine how many films are there now. I mean, you've been there recently.
Well, I mean, it's mind-blowing how much content, as the people that buy it call it.
Yes,
we call it stories.
We call it stories, they call it content. But of course, we only see an incredibly small slither of all of those films. So, you know, what we get here is the cream of the crop believe it or not. And a lot of those films don't necessarily do really well at the box office, even if they do try and embrace the hero's journey or the three-act structure. So there's no guarantee that that structure is going to give you a box office success. But if you just look at the history of box office successes, there are many, many incredibly successful films that don't fit a hero's journey, for example. So Jaws, Chief Brody in Jaws, that dude does not change. Like he is really safe from day one, and he is surrounded by reckless people that just try and make everything really bad, like just make the situation worse all the time. Ellen Ripley in Alien, the original Alien, she was totally right about following protocol when it came to quarantine. They should not have let that alien on the ship, like she said at the beginning, and she does not change through that story.
She would totally have worn a mask.
She totally would be wearing a mask. It's like, don't let that thing in here, people. And so she is the same all the way through. Die Hard, John McClane in that story, he is the same all the way through. At the one tiny moment in the film, he expresses some regret about being separated from his wife. But by the end of the story, she's changed her name back to his surname. So it's like she's the one that's changing. He's not changing. So there are all these, for every example that someone wants to throw at you saying your hero's journey will make the box office success, there are many, many examples that I talk about in the book where that's not the case. The hero does not have to change. Sometimes they can hold true to their values. Sometimes that'll work out. Sometimes it'll be a disaster. But there's room to move. So one of the reasons for writing the book, I guess, was to have a counter-argument for situations where writers are being bullied into fitting their story into a formula rather than seeing what's possible with what's proposed in their story.
You can take it into all of those tricky pitch meetings and beat someone over the head with it.
It's like, what about Die Hard? What about Alien? Didn't do that. Yeah, they did well.
You also deal with some really sort of tricky writing challenges, and I'm particularly thinking about ensembles and the different types of ensembles that you explore in the book. And you talked a little bit about television and how television arcs work, and that sort of seems to fit also into that ensemble territory. And I just wondered if you wanted to say a little bit more about those story structures that happen when there maybe isn't just one prominent or dominant point of view in the story.
Yeah, with the hero's journey, it's, the whole thing is structured around one point of view, the hero. But of course, most of the storytelling that we experience in this day and age is ensemble storytelling, because we're all watching way more TV than we ever have in the history of forever. And TV is an ensemble medium where there's, even though Breaking Bad is initially about Walter White, there's a family of characters around him that you get their unique point of view about what's going on in that story. And that's pretty much the case with all television shows. The reason for that is because television stories are very, very, very long. A movie lasts an hour and a half. A television story, if you added up 6 seasons of Breaking Bad or The Sopranos or whatever, you're talking about 80, 90 hours of storytelling. To make a story last that long, you've got to break it out into other characters' stories. And so this is where character arcs are kind of useful to you, because character arcs, that is the language of the TV writing room. The three-act structure or the hero's journey is irrelevant to a TV writing room, because you don't know when your story is ending. It might end after season 1, it might end after season 2, maybe if you're really lucky, you'll go to season 6. And you've got to find a way to plan the character arcs for each character across an episode, across a season, and across the entire series. And so, yeah, if you're in a writer's room, then the character arcs are the language of TV writing. And so ensemble storytelling.
And it's interesting how you explore in the book how those characters can work together, and sometimes by being similar to one another in terms of their arcs, and sometimes by being very different from one another and sort of almost competing.
Yeah, I look at Thelma and Louise in the book, and one of the things about Thelma and Louise is the contrast between those two characters. Both of them go through quite an enormous change, but you know, Thelma is very different to Louise, and that actually generates a lot of storytelling friction. You know, really helps move the story along. Whereas something like Hidden Figures, which is another story that I explore there, the character stories are all kind of parallel to each other. They don't necessarily always impact on each other. They're all going through a similar experience in a similar situation where there are three women trying to find their way into the space race and find a way to contribute to that workplace. And they're meeting a lot of obstacles which are similar to each other, but they don't necessarily impact on each other all the time. And then Shoplifters, I think it's the third one, where each of those characters, they all live together in the same environment, but once again, they don't necessarily, their stories impact on each other, but they have very different tones to them. So some of the storylines, some of the arcs in those in Shoplifters are actually really moving and uplifting. Others are quite sad, and others are kind of ambivalent, a little bit in between. So you've got this sort of really wide palette of tones and textures within that film, because the characters' arcs are also different from one another. They're not all the same. So and it's one of the wonderful things about ensemble storytelling is the range of tones that you can create out of it.
I think one of the things that I felt reading the book, and why I think it is a real gift to writers, because it has this kind of wonderful liberation at the heart of it. And I think that when you have screenwriters who, and other writers who are constantly trying to break through or to cut through actually, and to bring something to the table that is new, is fresh, is authentic, is, you know, all of those words that people use when they sit on panels and say, this is what we're looking for. But what I felt in the book was that your model gave license to that. But am I wrong? Is there a formula here? In your vision of this?
It's funny, like I sort of, in trying to describe a character arc, I sort of boil it down into three very simple concepts, very common sense words, because I want it to be accessible. And so, you know, it's about change that happens to the character. It's about the conflict that comes from that change, and it's about the internal choices they make. So change, conflict, choice. Very simple concepts, and basically you can use that in any sort of story. And you could kind of go, well, you know, isn't that a formula? And it's like, well, maybe, but like I kind of imagine it like old school Lego blocks. You can build anything out of those things. Whereas, you know, the 3-act structure or the hero's journey is more like an IKEA setup where you can only build one chair or one Billy bookcase out of those things. Like it comes with instructions and that's all you're going to get. Whereas, you know, those concepts of change, conflict, and choice, what are the choices your character is making? There's a lot of room to move there. And I'm not going to say that it's going to work in every story. In fact, at the end of the book, I talk about a film called Echo, a Scandinavian film, which is 46 separate scenes, I think it is, where every scene has a different character in a different situation. And you're just seeing that character's life for a moment. And I don't think character arcs are really going to help you understand that film. It's because it's not about that. You know, it's more just about watching those characters for that moment and wondering what their life is like, wondering what their character arc might be. And that's okay. Like, you know, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But my hope is that it certainly widens the landscape. I'm never going to say that my particular approach is going to work for every storytelling approach in every single situation. It's not that type of book. But I feel strongly that it certainly widens the landscape for writers.
I think it does, and as somebody who's tried to build a Billy bookcase, I do always worry about what to do with those screws and things that seem to be left along the floor at the
You've
end
got
of
to
it.
follow the 3-act structure.
Yeah, that's probably my mistake. I'm going to throw out to you some questions from the audience now, so I hope you've all got some to ask.
We also have many questions from Zoom as
Oh,
well.
have we?
Yeah, we do.
Brilliant.
We have lots of Zoom
Zoom
questions.
has come to life.
So one of the questions from Zoom was from Cass Moriarty, from, I don't know what she's from, Townsville at the moment. Your workshop and your ideas in this book really gave me permission to explore stories that don't follow a traditional structure and that it's okay to have an ambiguous ending. Do you think there's a difference between how a film can or should end as opposed to a book? Is there more flexibility in a novel? Are most film goers less forgiving of experimentation or more open to it?
Actually, that's not easy.
Yeah. Cass was in the workshop that I did a couple of years ago and gave me the impulse to write the book. That's a hard one. I guess one of the things about films is how much money they cost. They like even just a small budget film costs millions and millions of dollars. And so I guess that's why film is probably a more inherently conservative medium, where it's like they really need to make the money back, and so risk taking and going out on a limb is harder to do. However, having said that, one of the things that really does sell at the moment, or really gets attention, is unique voices and unique ways of telling the story and unique points of view we've never heard before. And so all of the TV shows we're talking about at the moment, getting really excited about, they're unique in there's a reason why Fleabag really broke through at that time, because there's nothing like it. It's so strange, and it's such a unique point of view and a unique voice. The beauty about novels that, of course I know because I've watched Chrissy write 8 of them, is how much space you've got to experiment and to try new things. And Chrissy's a fantastic example of incredibly unique voice. No one tells a story the way Chrissy tells a story. And that's because she's got the space to kind of figure it out, because it's just her at a desk with me, badgering her about, what about the structure?
And they'd be terrible without structure. Any questions from the audience before I go to another Zoom question? Anyone in real life have a question for Anthony? Jason?
I'm curious about the title, Beyond the Hero's Journey. And if you think it's a little bit provocative, are you trying to put a metaphorical there, or are you maybe just trying to start a conversation or something like that?
A lot of you know me, I'm not a very confrontational person. I avoid conflict wherever I can. But I guess it is a little provocative. And I was a bit intimidated by taking on the 3-act structure in the hero's journey. Like they are massive in screenwriting. And I'm really genuinely curious how people respond to it when it's out there. I'm probably going to get trolled. It's a good thing I'm not on social media, so I'm fine. But yeah,
Don't troll it, it's not worth it.
yes. But yeah, I guess there is a slight provocation in that, as much as I can manage.
There's a question from BJ on Zoom. Has Anthony noticed that his favourite contemporary films showcase a particular arc, and which films would you have included, love to include, but didn't make the cut? So do you like a particular arc, or which ones didn't make the cut?
I can answer that both with one film. So Portrait of a Lady on Fire. It made me fall in love with feature films again. you know, it felt like it had been a while since I'd seen a feature film that was just so perfectly realised. And in that story, if you haven't seen it, please see it. I'm not spoiling anything for you here, but you know, it's about two changed characters. These two women, you know, fundamentally change throughout the story. They're different people by the end, but it has quite an ambivalent ending, and it's beautiful and heartbreaking. It's happy. It's a perfect balance of happy, sad, and I love those sorts of films. I love that complexity. I love it when things aren't a little bit more open-ended, I guess. So yeah, Portrait of the Lady on Fire is a great example of that. And I did write a chapter on it, and I eventually had to, I chose to drop it out of the book. Maybe it'll be in a special edition sometime, but I dropped it out of the book to include The Nightingale, because I wanted to include more Australian films that I thought were really important. And The Nightingale is another example of a deeply ambivalent arc in the protagonist's story. So I included that instead.
You can pop it into the UK and the US editions when they come out.
Yes, yeah, I'm writing a couple of extra chapters for the UK and US edition. So you'll have to buy that one too.
Excellent. There are more questions online, but is there any other questions in the room at the moment? Yes, Alex.
If you decide to go down a non-traditional route, so don't follow the hero's journey arc, do you have to follow other rules to make the story still work?
So can you say that again?
I can repeat it. So if you're going down a non-traditional, non-hero's journey arc, do you have to follow other rules to make the story work?
Not really. I mean, I guess it's like the book sort of lays out some ideas about things to think about. And so thinking about, you know, how is your character's world changing? You know, what's the external change happening to the character? What's the sort of conflict that's generating in the character's life? And what is the emotional response that they're having? What are the choices they're making in response to that conflict? And what I sort of argue in the book is those three ideas, that's what we make story out of. It's like the world around the character is not the way they want it, you know, in terms of how they feel on the inside. And so they either choose to do things or not do things. How do those choices reveal who they are? And how do those choices get them to the end of the story? And it might kind of sound simple, but it's like the notes on a piano. Like, you know, there's only 12 of them. 12, there's not many of them. Seven maybe.
It's not a pin.
Octave. It's an octave, it's got extras.
Yeah, there's
8.
but like there's not many keys on a piano, but you know, you can make all sorts of music with them, I guess, is the point. Terrible, I made that so bad. I've got to look up my music.
Later I'll do my book.
This is not a book about
which is
music theory.
terrible.
It's about screenwriting theory, not music theory.
There's a question from Zoom from Carol, who wants to know what are your main sources for inspiration for your writing?
My wife, Chrissy.
Oh no, we're not accepting that.
Not accepting.
I'm glad you said that. I was also not going to accept it for the
I watch very, I sort of graze across a lot of genres, and just recently, actually one of the very few joys of last year being in lockdown was subscribing to Movie, which is an art house and world cinema streaming service. Chris and I subscribed to that because we were running out of things we wanted to watch, and I just saw so many interesting films from around the world, beautiful films, and so I guess I try to see as many different types of films as I possibly can. It's impossible these days to see everything. It used to be possible. When I started out in this industry, there were people that, you know, you kind of had the vibe that they really had seen everything, but not anymore. But I try to watch as many things as I can. I guess because I just want to, I'm endlessly curious about how people put stories together. Yeah.
So we've got time for one more question. I'm going to preference the room for people who came out on this cold and blustery night. Anybody have a last question for Anthony?
There's someone at the back who really
Yes.
wants to ask one.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I was just wondering, when you're writing a story, do you tend to start with the character or the premise?
I generally start, these days I start with a character, much more than I used to. I remember when I was first starting out, it would usually be a plot point, like something weird would happen. Like the short film that got into Cannes, it was about a guy that comes across a stoplight in the middle of nowhere. And like a couple of friends and I came up with that in Gilhoolies, I think it was, we were drinking dinners. And like that was enough for us. It's just like, there's a stoplight, middle of nowhere. And we just kind of followed the thread. But more and more these days, possibly because I've worked mostly in television, I gravitate towards character more and think much more about the character. And because I'm trying to think of, if this is going to be a TV show, how do I make this character's progression? How do I make their journey last a long time? So yeah, for me it's character, but everyone's different. I meet writers all the time. Some start with character, some start with plot, others start with theme. There's a particular theme or idea that they want to explore. Yeah, it's just different.
Well, thank you, Anthony, and I wanted to thank all of you for coming out and being part of the launch of this wonderful book, and also to thank Chrissy and the team here at Avid Reader for having us. And I know that Anthony has got a few thank yous of his own that he wants to make, so I'll hand over to him to wrap us up.
Sure. Thanks everyone for coming out tonight. I know that there's there's plenty of reasons to stay home at the moment, so I really appreciate you coming out and spending tonight with us. I'd also like to thank Avid Reader for hosting these beautiful events and for contributing so much to the writing community in Brisbane, and wonderful Joe. You contribute so much to the film industry here, and I really appreciate you being on my side tonight, but you've been on the side of Queensland filmmakers for very many years, and we really appreciate it. This book is the result of a lot of conversations with a lot of incredibly smart people. I'd like to quickly acknowledge a few of them. My early readers, Chrissy Nee, Lucas Taylor, Kaz Moriarty, Sally Piper, Stephen Barg, Jackie Janelle, and Simon Kennedy. Thank you for your intelligence and your patience as I gathered my thoughts. In particular, I'd like to thank Ashley Hay, who hadn't actually read the book. I sat down and had a conversation with Ashley about trying to figure out the ending of the book, and she cracked it like in a 5-minute coffee conversation. So that's how good she is. I suddenly knew how to end the book. Where is Ashley? There you are. Oh my God. Thank you so much, Ashley. That was amazing. It's a great coffee. My agents, Jane Novak and Dane Kelly, for all the time and effort you put into my projects, I really appreciate that. My publisher, New South Publishing, particularly Harriet McInerney, project manager, Sophia Alvarez, copy editor, Gabrielle Stereo, designer, Josephine Pajor Marcus, and cover designer, Josh Durham. Thank you for your enthusiasm and your passion for the project. Mirandi Rewo, Kaz Moriarty, Laura Elbury and Sally Piper of the unofficial Brisbane Literary Mafia, who suggested this book after I did the workshop with them here on the veranda. I'm eternally grateful for your...
Chris Olsen too, actually.
Chris Olsen, yes, Chris Olsen, yes. I'm eternally grateful for your encouragement. Chris was there too, wasn't she? Oh my God, I forgot to thank her.
She's here earlier as well.
Yeah,
Have to send her
she's
a
going to
note.
hold that against me. Okay, I'll make it up. My doctoral supervisors, Trish Fitzsimons, Margaret McVeigh, Charlie Strachan and Penny Bundy, and my master's supervisors, Gerard Lee and Stuart Glover. Many of the ideas in this book are the result of direct conversations with you. Finally, I'd like to thank my parents, Helen and Peter, who have watched on with faith and sort of mild amusement as I was trying to figure out what I've been doing with my life, and I'm still kind of working on that at the moment. But you know, they stuck in there, and of course, Chrissy Neame, my best friend and partner of 30 years. I couldn't have done any of this without Chrissy. So,
The thing that a publicist once told me was that if a writer gets on stage and talks about their wife, generally they're having an affair with somebody. But that's, in this case, I know that that's not actually true. We have enjoyed, since the lockdown, we've really been enjoying writing together again, and it's been some of the most creative times of my life to get back to writing with Anthony, because he is the best at structure and story that I've ever come across. It's quite amazing how he's
she didn't
trained.
always used to say that. It's like,
No,
I love with your
I
structure.
hated it at first. So I do recommend that everybody who is writing does dip into this book, because it actually, I used to resist the idea of structure and thinking about a book in a particular way, but now I realise that it's really, really important, and it has changed my life. So I would like to declare this book officially now double launched.
Yeah.
So congratulations. And we are going to move Anthony to his signing table at the front of the shop, and we're going to mob him there. So yeah, let's do that. Do remember your masks when you're going back through the shop too. Thank you, everyone.
I don't know if I can pay.
Thanks, Joe. That was fantastic.
I don't know how to do it.
Yeah, you just press it up.
I press it up.
And then hold it until it goes off.
That was the bit I wasn't doing. Because I've asked
I know it's very confusing. So we're gonna go and have food next door.
Yeah, that'd be lovely.